I'll start with what is probably on most people's minds today. I'll use a dirty word, and that word is context. I go to Harvard, so it's a very dirty word. The context is my brother just had a son today. This is his second child. He's in Israel, so that child, thank you. That child has spent its entirety of life in a bomb shelter. That child has not been outside yet, and that is, of course, because this morning, or this afternoon, our time, Iran launched more than 200 ballistic missiles at Israel. And this is part of a much larger geopolitical context and a much larger regional war, which is really beginning on October 6th. October 6th, where there was a ceasefire. Of course, the next day, Hamas broke that 3-year ceasefire by, of course, murdering, raping, and maiming 1,200 Jewish, Christian, and Muslim citizens. That initiated a response by Hezbollah, of course an Iranian proxy that had fired more than 10,000 rockets into Israel, all indiscriminate, of course, so landing on hospitals, landing on schoolyards, landing in nursing homes. And then finally, in the last month or so, the Netanyahu administration has had a very unusual but remarkable response, which are these very targeted, very deliberate precision strikes. So it started with those beepers about 2 weeks ago, then the walkie-talkies the next day, and then, of course, really the political climax of that was the assassination of Nasrallah. So Iran, which really Hezbollah and Hamas and the Houthis, they only get their power, of course, from Tehran. Iran is funding all of this. Nothing happens without Khomeini's approval. So Iran responds today with their ballistic missile attack. The reason I'm bringing this up is because that brother of mine, he's now called into Miluim, reserve duty, and he will be going into Lebanon on October 7th, which will also be the day of his son's circumcision, his Brit Milah. And I texted him this morning, and I said, how do you feel? Or do you want to go into Lebanon? I mean, would you rather stay back? And he said, it is such a privilege that after 900 years of not being able to fight and defend the Jewish people, for the first time, I get to do that. And what a privilege and what an honor. And while it is true that we in the diaspora, we cannot affect the regional war, we cannot affect what happens in Gaza or in Lebanon or in Yemen or in Iran, what we can do is fight on the battlefront of ideas. We can fight in the classroom, in academia, in the halls of power, in the halls of Congress, and that's a fight that I've been privileged to wage. I encourage each and every one of you, whatever your capacity is, to wage that fight with us. But the reality is, number one, we're outnumbered, and number two, we're outgunned. And what I've been trying to do in a personal capacity at Harvard University is not only expose what I call the moral and intellectual rot at the center of these alleged elite universities, or as Virginia Fox would say, expensive universities, but also try to spread light and, more specifically, try to spread the values of Western civilization, the Jewish and American values that are really hand in hand. And that is what has kept me going. And I know that even though I'm not in Israel, I'm not in the Middle East, but I'm playing a role in that fight. And as I said, each and every one of you can play a role in that fight as well. It's not just filing lawsuits against Harvard, although if you guys want to do that, I certainly encourage you. But it's not just filing lawsuits, and it's not just speaking in Congress. It's not just representing presidential candidates, but it's really building a coalition across this country. I've been in a different city every day for the last 7 months, building a coalition of, in particular, young people and young Jews who've woken up post-October 7th, and we are certainly not going back to sleep. So that's, I hope, a little introduction about myself, and if I totally ignored the question, I'm really sorry.
No, the questions are coming. What's your Harvard school degree?
Oh, sure. Okay, that's an easy one. So, religion and public policy. I come from an Orthodox family of 7, which is pretty typical for my community, and I always grew up with an appreciation of American values and Jewish values. If any of you saw my speech at the Republican convention, I made a point of expressing that American values are Jewish values are American values, and that's because of how I was raised. My dad started the first auction house in America specializing in rare Jewish books, so I grew up in a household where every single wall was covered in 18th and 17th century manuscripts. That's where I really got this passion of Judaism from, and world religion broadly speaking. So I wanted to go to Harvard to really pursue that on a intellectual level, but also on a totally non-Jewish, non-religious, pluralistic level, something I'd never done before. So even though I'm in my 20s, this is really the first time I was taking classes with women, taking classes with non-Jews, learning about other religions. And on the one hand, I found it incredibly invigorating, incredibly meaningful. But on the other hand, as I'm sure we'll talk about, it really exposed me to this shocking anti-Israel, anti-Semitic, anti-American bias that really permeated so many of the classes that I took part in, and that really infected the ideologies not just of young students, but of the professors as well.
What was your experience on the Harvard campus after October 7?
Sure. So, people often ask me, what was it like post-October 7th? But I think to really understand the issues at Harvard and of institutions of higher learning broadly speaking, we actually have to go to the night of October 7th. So I'm an Orthodox Jew, meaning I don't use my phone on Shabbat or any electronics. And we were at the Harvard Chabad, which is the main institution of Jewish life on campus. And October 7th, of course, was the Jewish joyous holiday of Shmini Atzeret and Simchas Torah. We're, of course, coming up to the one-year anniversary. And we're celebrating, we're dancing, we have the Torah in our hands, we're drinking. It's a very fun, joyous holiday. And all of a sudden, these rumors began to circulate. There was a bombing, no, it was a stabbing, no, it was a shooting. The reality is, I don't know how much we all know about the reality of a state of Israel, but the reality of a state of Israel, I lived there for 3 years. I know you lived there for some time.
For 3 years.
For 3 years, so terrorism happens. I mean, it's a fact of life of living in Israel. I lived in the old city of Jerusalem, 2 minutes away from the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the Western Wall, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and there was a stabbing 2 doors down from where I lived, and it's bad, we don't like it, but that's the reality. So when we heard these rumors, we were upset, but there was not much we could do, and it certainly was not out of the ordinary. However, the rumors persisted, and not only did they persist, but they were strengthened. And it became clear that what was happening was something that I, as a young person, had never experienced before in my life, and that is Israel as an existential issue. Israel where its legitimacy and its existence is very much called into question. And so even though I don't use my phone on the Sabbath, for the first time in my life, and actually my rabbi told me to do this, is I went back to my dorm and I took out my phone and I began calling my loved ones. I have 4 siblings in Israel, grandparents, aunts, uncles, a 2-year-old nephew, now a 1-day-old nephew as well. And this brother who I mentioned, he's in the army. He's very much affected by this. And I spent hours trying to locate them. And thank God they were okay. But that is not true of all Harvard Jewish students who are contacting loved ones. Many lost friends and family on October 7th. But I wish I could say the story ended there. I was on a panel with MLK's niece. Yeah, it was her niece. About 2-3 weeks ago in D.C. And she reminded me of this great line by her uncle, which is, "We will not remember the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends." We would have been lucky at Harvard, we would have been lucky at Columbia, at Penn, at MIT, at NYU, at all these places, if we had the silence of our friends. But the reality is, and this is where the story gets arguably more upsetting, the most elite of our society, the most intellectually renowned, those who are the most morally sensitive, they saw the images of Jewish women bleeding from their private areas. They saw the images and videos of Jewish babies like Kfir Bibas crying as they're being hoarded onto motorcycles taken into Gaza. They saw the images of burnt bodies in cars. And their immediate reaction, 34 student groups representing more than 1,000 students, was to draft an emergency statement, that's their words, to draft what they called an emergency statement to blame Jews for the largest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. I'm not exaggerating. They jumped out of beds in their pajamas to do this. The statement began, and they took it down because they're allergic to accountability, but I kept this up on my social media. "We hold the Israeli apartheid regime entirely responsible for all ongoing violence in the Middle East." At the Harvard student WhatsApp group that I was a part of, before they kicked me out, was a student posted, again, on the night of October 7th, a picture of a rally that they were organizing called "Long Live the Resistance, Victory is Ours." And the response from these Harvard students was as if he was planning a picnic. "Is this open to the community? Can I bring my dog? I'd love to help make signs." And Harvard purports to train the next generation of American leaders, of policymakers, of thought leaders, religious leaders, and by and large, they're kind of right. It's not an exaggeration to state, statistically speaking, I probably sat in a class with a future congressman or senator or even president. And if these are America's future leaders, I hope you can now appreciate this is not merely an issue of anti-Semitism or Israel. It's an issue that directly affects each and every American. Because whether they like it or not, whether they realize it or not, they will be governed by these people. These people will be authoring the books that your children read. They will be voting on and implementing policy that will affect you and your kids. So that was just the night of October 7th. And I'll just say very quickly, sorry, I give very long answers. I will say very quickly, this ushered in a period of things I would not have believed could have happened in the United States in any year, forget about the 21st century, at any point in American history, had I not seen it myself. We had a Jewish student who was physically assaulted at Harvard Business School. We had a Jewish student at Harvard spat on for wearing a kippah. We had an Israeli student being told by her professor to leave the class because her nationality made other people uncomfortable. We had students post on the Harvard social media channel SideChat saying that the Harvard Hillel should burn, saying that they stand with the resistance. We had students organize a rally on October 11th with Palestinian flags and signs like Harvard Invests in Genocide, where a student speaker, Kojo, gets up and says, Hamas is not a terrorist organization. We will look upon them in 10 years as freedom fighters. Who are we to condemn the resistance? In my case, there was a staff member who challenged me to debate him as to whether Jews were behind 9/11, and then threatened me with a machete, saying that he has a plan to fight and take down the Zionist mafia. I mean, I had private armed security outside my house for a week. I had a guy with a gun follow me to Chabad to make sure I was okay. This was all on the night and then post October 7th. But if you really want to talk about anti-Semitism at Harvard, this has been going on for forever. Literally forever. I mean, Harvard, just 100 years ago, was led by President Abbott Lowell, who was a Nazi sympathizer, which was very similar to most Ivy League presidents. He instituted quotas on how many Jews were allowed to be admitted into the university. Because in his own words, there are, quote, too many damn Jews at the university. So, as a fun fact, there were more Jews at Harvard as a percentage under the quota system than there are today. At its peak, Harvard was 25% Jewish. Today, it's 4% Jewish. It's not because Jews got dumber over time. It's because there's been a deliberate campaign to crack down on the amount of Jews admitted. And I'll say this last thing, and then I'll shut up. I wrote an article for H.com, a Jewish publication, entitled Anti-Semitism at Harvard. And I wrote it in October of 2022. And no one read it. The article did not generate really any clicks or outrage. But it was happening, and it was happening for decades. And it is a shame that it took the largest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust for policymakers and for the Jewish nonprofit space to take this issue seriously.
Shabbos, thank you so much for long answers.
Yeah, sorry guys.
I will try to speak faster. Zev Mitchell in the July 19, 2024 forward says that his experience in Harvard School was that I spent the last year feeling like a full integrated member of the campus community. And the second part, you conflated pro-Palestinian campus activism with anti-Semitism, a process movement that at Harvard includes many Jews. How do you answer Mitchell?
Sure. So Zev Mitchell is a Jew, as you said, a Jewish student at Harvard University, and he wrote I want to say scathing because that gives it too much credit. He wrote an article criticizing me, which is his right to do, saying that I don't speak for the Jews at Harvard, saying that I conflate, as you said, pro-Palestinian activities with anti-Semitism.
He said.
Right. He said that I do that. I don't. I'll say two things. One, what Zev Mitchell in this article forgot to mention, weirdly enough, is that he regularly took part in protests calling for the Intifada, that he was a student leader during the encampments. So, to be a little impolite, no shit, I don't speak for him. I would never want to speak for him. That's also another point, which is the Harvard Crimson, which is the country's oldest and longest-serving student newspaper. They called me the self-declared spokesman of the Jews at Harvard, when, again, I never once said that. Jews come in all shapes and stripes and different ideological backgrounds, and that's fine. And I'm not speaking for them, I speak for myself and for those who've entrusted me with their stories. So that's number one. I mean, it's just his attacks are silly. In terms of the main argument, though, which is I conflate pro-Palestinian activism with anti-Semitism, is number one, I remember driving, this is 2-3 years ago, 4.5 hours from New York to D.C. to protest the speech that the then finance minister Bezalel Smotrich was giving to a Jewish nonprofit. I don't remember seeing Zev Michel there, but I've been protesting the Bibi government way before all these accusations that I'm this partisan hack who believes that anti-Zionism is off limits. So I've been protesting the Bibi government for a very, very long time. However, I had an interview with Glenn Greenwald on Friday. For those of you who know Glenn Greenwald, you know he's not exactly the biggest friend of the Jewish people. And he made a similar point, saying, oh, you're just trying to stifle free speech. Number one, when when an employee taunts you with a machete, challenging you to debate him as to whether Jews are behind 9/11, that's not free speech. When masked students, or we presume that they're students, we actually don't know, which is a major security concern, when they bypass the university's security officers and they bang on glass windows calling for an intifada, that's not free speech. When they block Jewish students and Jewish students alone from going into the libraries, that's not free speech. 99% of what we allege in our lawsuit, of what we talk about on the national media, has anything to do with speech at all, let alone free speech. Has almost nothing to do with speech. I was at the University of Pittsburgh on Thursday, and I was speaking with the students there. As I was speaking, all of a sudden these alerts go off, and the students were notified by campus police that night there had been a physical altercation where a Jewish student was beat up by 6 assailants. They were taunting F Jews, kill the kikes. That was the 3rd physical assault against a Jewish student at the University of Pittsburgh this month alone. That has nothing to do with free speech. So we have to get out of these binaries that somehow we're trying to stifle free speech and we're against the First Amendment. That's number one. Number two, and this is a more broader point, Harvard University was ranked by the Foundation of Individual Rights and Expressions, which is an American NGO /think tank that evaluates universities as it pertains to free speech and their protection of the First Amendment. They ranked about 4 or 5 years ago 248 American universities. How well do they do on protecting free speech? Harvard was ranked 248th. They were ranked dead last. They were actually given a special distinction of being particularly terrible when it comes to upholding free speech. This is a university that routinely rescinds and disinvites controversial speakers, expels students for offensive speech, does almost nothing to encourage the exercise of intellectual discourse. The only time Harvard concerns itself with the First Amendment is when the free speech is being used to amplify Jew hatred and anti-Semitism. That is unquestionably the case. And then to make a more fundamental point, when I'm not suing Harvard, I actually study the Holocaust. That's what I'm there to do. I haven't been able to do it much, but that's what I'm there to do. In the 1930s, there was an organization called the National Association of German Jewry. And you know what that National Association of German Jewry was? It was the Jewish division of the Nazi Party. That literally existed. And by the way, you know why they were disbanded? Because all their members were killed in gas chambers. So we unfortunately, in Jewish history and as the Jewish people, we unfortunately always have what's called in biblical terms the Erev Rav, which is literally translated as the mixed multitude, but it basically means, those who identify as Jewish, who will say as a Jew, but they almost exclusively work against our interests. So of course, Zev Michel is right. There were Jews who took part in the encampments, but that doesn't make their message any less anti-Semitic. When you call for the destruction of the Jewish state, when you follow, as was my case, when you follow Jews on their way to class, when you tell Jewish students you're not allowed onto this area of campus, that is unquestionably anti-Semitic, whether you're Muslim, whether you're Christian, whether you're Jewish. And it's a pity that as a Jewish community, there are more and more people like these Zev Michels who are so disconnected from their identity, who are so disconnected from their people, from their land, that they think it is appropriate, they think it is encouraged, and they actually think it is in line with Jewish values to talk about the destruction of the Jewish state from the river to the sea.
Back to Israel, do you believe that criticism of Israel is anti-Semitism?
There is not a Jewish person alive, including Benjamin Netanyahu, who thinks that criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. The best example is, have you ever spoken to an Israeli ever? That is literally all they do. Where people get this from, I assume, is the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, which does not in any way say that criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. What it does say is if you hold Israel to a double standard, If you criticize Israel for things that you deliberately not criticize other countries for doing the exact same thing, that is anti-Semitic. And I 100% agree with that. So for example, if you want to talk about settler colonialism or apartheid or genocide, but you, like Glenn Greenwald or like Norman Finkelstein or Noam Chomsky, but you will not talk about Iran or Qatar or Saudi Arabia, but you have this obsession with the state of Israel, that unquestionably is anti-Semitic. But again, the criticism of Israel, the criticism of Israeli policy, of course is not anti-Semitic. As I said, I've criticized Israel way more than Zev Michel and these idiots in the encampments. I will also add just one more point. Again, I'm going to sound like a broken record here. I'm an Orthodox Jew, meaning I pray 3 times a day. You know which direction I pray in? And that Jews have been praying in for 2,500 years? Jerusalem. You know what we mention in our prayers more than every other thing? More than world peace? More than the ending of hunger? More than the coming of the Messiah? Is the return to Zion. We've been saying that for 2,500 years. And in fact, I had a Fox interview on Tisha B'Av, which is, it falls out around August time. It's the saddest day of the Jewish year. And I was telling the producers, or I was telling the interviewers, I said, you know, you're interviewing me, I was in LA at the time, I'm actually sitting on the floor. And I'm actually not eating, and I'm not drinking. And I'm abstaining from marital relation. I mean, I'm single, so it wasn't much of a problem. But why am I doing all this? Because 2,500 years ago, the Babylonians and then the Romans destroyed our holy temple in Jerusalem. And 2,500 years later, Jews like me, who've never seen the temple before in our lives, we abstain from food and drink and leather shoes and sitting on chairs and couches to commemorate that day. So when any individual, Jew or non, tries to negate the intrinsic connection that Jews have with our land, that is inherently anti-Semitic. And in fact, it's remarkable. The Jewish people are the only minority group and really the only religion in the world that is literally named after the place they come from. We are called Jews because of Judea, Yehudim from the tribe and the region of Yehuda, the Judean Samaria. To deny our blatant religious, historical connection to that land is tantamount to, as we say, is tantamount to cutting off our right hand. The return to Zion, the centrality of Israel, is such a focal point of our religious identity that anyone who denies that is denying our religion and is engaging in anti-Semitism.
I couldn't agree more. There is anti-Semitism on the right. For example, the chant "Jewish will not replace us." Also, there is anti-Semitism on the left, with the chant of "From the river to the sea," and support for the BDC movement. Which is more dangerous, in your opinion?
Which is so look, spoiler, I'm a registered Democrat. I've only voted for Democrats, and my congressman is Richard Torres. I will continue, who's a gay, black progressive, who I will continue to vote for, and I hope he runs for president. But I did wade into electoral politics when I endorsed Trump reluctantly a couple of weeks ago. I will continue to call out far-left anti-Semitism in the same way I will call out far-right anti-Semitism. Although I spoke at the Republican convention, I very proudly and loudly walked out when Tucker Carlson was given a standing ovation when he spoke, and I think it's a shame and an embarrassment that he was able to sit next to President Trump. When Trump Jr. was meant to do some panel with Candace Owens, I immediately contacted the Trump campaign, and to their credit, he pulled back from the event. Candace Owens is a reprehensible, intellectually challenged individual, who I'll continue to call out. So I don't think that calling out anti-Semitism needs to be a partisan game. My loyalty is not to a political party, it's not to a politician, it's not even to a policy. My loyalty is to Jewish Americans and the Jewish people, and I will continue to call that out left and right. At the same time, while it is true we cannot deny right-wing anti-Semitism, the anti-Semitism that Jewish Americans are experiencing, the anti-Semitism that I experienced, it did not come from Trump supporters. Okay? It just didn't. The people who were preventing Jews from studying in the library were not Trump supporters. They were not right-wing extremists. They were not conservatives. They were people who I used to march with Black Lives Matter, They were people who believe in reproductive rights, who believe in a $15 minimum wage, who believe in a Green New Deal, who are staunchly supporting Kamala Harris. Which is why, of course, she said during the outbreak of the protest that these protesters who are burning the American flag, who are preventing Jews from accessing their classroom, she said explicitly that these protesters are showing what human emotion ought to show. So we have to call a spade a spade. There's only one party, I believe, or one candidate, I should say, that is really kowtowing and massaging these anti-Semitic, anti-Israel protesters, and for all of his faults, it's not Donald Trump. It really isn't. And again, I'm not a Trump guy. I don't like most of his policies. But Kamala Harris has not met with a single Jewish student in her 4 years of being vice president, up to and including October 7th. I have tried getting the White House to do these roundtables with Jewish students. They ignored me every time. I tried getting the Democratic Convention to platform young progressive Jews who are fighting for their civil rights on college campuses in the same way the RNC platformed me. They had no interest in doing it. I testified in front of the House Judiciary Committee. The ranking Democratic member was Jerry Nadler. He fell asleep. I testified in front of the House Education Committee. The ranking Democratic member, Bobby Scott, criticized the testimony, criticized Republicans for focusing on anti-Semitism. I didn't say these things out loud for months because I'm a Democrat. I didn't want to badmouth my party. But there's a limit to how much good faith we can give these people. And much like the Ivy Leagues, I think the only way we can hold them accountable is if we leave. And if we can show the Democratic Party that you've taken the Jewish vote for granted for far too long, I think finally they will make a change. But they're not going to make a change if they think, well, who cares, because we'll still get 75% of the Jew vote anyways. And that's basically been their attitude. I can tell you that because I know these people. I know the Democratic political operatives. I know the Democratic Jewish Democrats who are leading places like the Jewish Democratic Council of America. They have no interest in real serious reform because they know that 75% of American Jews will just continue to vote for them regardless of what they do and what they say.
The accusation of genocide against Israel has been a popular one in Palestinian anti-war process. There is also a mischaracterization of Israel as an apartheid colonialist power. Where do you think it originates, and what should be done to correct it?
I mean, historically, if you really want to go back, the claims of Israel as an apartheid regime, the claims of settler colonialism, it really began under the Soviet Union. I'm not going to get into the whole history now, but it was employed by the Soviets shortly after the Six-Day War, where they basically realized, well, we can't really beat the Israelis militarily. We just can't. What they can do, which has been really successful, and far more successful than blowing up any pizza shop is, which is using academia, using what's called, it's using the law as a manipulation. It's called...
Lawfare.
What's it called?
Lawfare.
Yeah, lawfare. Yeah, is it lawfare?
Lawfare.
Okay, lawfare. Yeah, it is. Warfare, lawfare. You're right. Using lawfare, weaponizing the law, which is what the ICJ was basically built to do in terms of Israel. And they're pretty successful at it. The claims of genocide are so remarkably idiotic that it makes sense that Harvard students say it, because it's remarkably idiotic. Genocide is the targeted destruction of a people. There are fewer Jews living today in the world than there were before the Holocaust. Why? Because there was an actual genocide. It was called the Holocaust. We still have not recouped the amount of Jews that were living in the world in 1939. The idea that Israel is committing a genocide, again, before we even get into their conduct in Gaza, makes zero sense if you just look at the data. If genocide is the targeted killing and the eradication of a people, then how come the rate of living Palestinians has exploded since 1948? There are more Palestinians living in the West Bank, living in Gaza, living in genocide. They're doing a pretty shitty job at it. So the accusations are so remarkably idiotic. I mean, it's just like fascinating how you can truly get the alleged leading intellectuals of our time to fall for such an obvious falsehood. Same thing with apartheid. I mean, it's so offensive, remarkably so, and this is why you have so many activists from South Africa who speak up against it. It's so remarkably offensive to people who've actually faced discrimination, who've actually faced apartheid and a legalized system of discrimination, to claim that Israel is committing apartheid. And again, just look at the data, just look at the numbers. You have Arab citizens. First of all, you have Arab citizens, that's number one. You have Arab citizens who are serving on the Supreme Court, who are serving as members of Knesset. I mean, the most powerful political party in the state of Israel 4 years ago was the Arab Coalition. They were the most powerful party. In fact, the reason the coalition collapsed is because the Arab party decided they didn't want to be part of the coalition anymore. That's how much power Arab citizens have in this country. They were offered peace more than 15 times, dating back from before the existence of the State of Israel. And they rejected it time after time after time. Arab citizens represent 25% of Israeli society. So the claims of apartheid are rejected by the lived experiences of actual Palestinians. It's obviously rejected by the data and the statistics. And it's rejected by, as I said, the reality on the ground, which is why most of the people, I can speak to Harvard, and although I can make a pretty good argument that this is the case of most of the Ivy Leagues, but at least at Harvard, the Zev Michels and the people who are leading the encampments and leading calls for an intifada, they've never been to Israel before in their lives. And it shows. Because if they had gone to Israel, if they ever go to Israel for more than a day, they would realize, number one, wow, all the Jews criticize the Israeli government. And they would also realize, wow, my taxi driver is an Arab. All the road signs are in Arabic, English, and Hebrew. I mean, their rhetoric is simply not matched by reality, which is why they deliberately close themselves off to reality. They take classes that reinforce their political narratives. In their own words, we don't debate Zionists. You know, there was a producer from The Hill who reached out to me shortly after October 7th. He said, let's do a live TV debate between you and a pro-Palestinian leader at Harvard, and you'll shake hands at the end and you'll model respectful dialogue. The interview has never been aired, it's never been filmed, because we've not been able to find one pro-Palestinian student leader at Harvard who's willing to debate us, because in their own words, we don't validate or legitimize the position of Zionists. So it's an unbelievably frustrating system.
50% of Columbia campus protesters were estimated to be outside agitators. Also, organizers with Hamas links have been identified on other campuses. How do you suggest they be stopped?
Sure. So yeah, it is true. About 50% of those who were protesting at Columbia were outside actors. That's primarily because within our lifetime, which should be labeled as a domestic terrorist group because they receive most of their funds, and you can read this in the National Jewish Advocacy Center. They just had a lawsuit against Within Our Lifetime, Code Pink, Students for Justice in Palestine. They receive most of their funding from Iranian proxies or directly from Qatar, or certainly in the case of Code Pink, they receive it from the Chinese Communist Party. So they really are paid protesters. In fact, of the 180 Columbia affiliates, let's say, who were arrested for their taking over of Hamilton Hall, of taking a maintenance worker hostage, of vandalizing private property, of refusing to leave, about 150 of them were not actually Columbia students. So the best way we can, or there are a couple of ways to stop them. Number one really is, as the expression goes, what is it, sunlight is the best disinfectant or something like, yeah, sunlight is the best disinfectant. We have to expose them. I don't think people really realize the extent of outside actors who are involved and integral to these efforts. So the Biden administration's National Security Council, led by John Kirby, they had a report about, I guess it was 3-4 months ago, and it showed, this is not a political statement, this is the objective fact, they show that Iran is funding a tremendous amount to these outside agitators. The problem was the Biden administration didn't really follow up and say what they would do to stop it, but we know that Iran is funneling a lot of money in this. So number one is disinfectant. You have to expose this. People don't really realize the extent of what's going on. Number two is you have to hold them accountable. So my attitude with Harvard is, fine, if you don't want to play ball, then we'll make a judge in a court of law sort of force you to play ball. That's what our lawsuit does, and that's what the National Jewish Advocacy Center is doing. That's what many organizations like the ADL, like the AJC, are doing, and each of us in our own capacities can help expose what's happening. And then number three, this is more, again, speaking generally, but sort of like cryptocurrency, I really do believe that the Ivy Leagues get their legitimacy, get their prestige, and certainly get their support because we give them prestige and we give them support and we give them value. But the moment we stop doing it, then they sort of lose half of what they're running on. I mean, Harvard's been running on their reputation for decades now. Were the classes so superior? Were they so qualitatively different? I mean, they were good, don't get me wrong, but not really. So I think if the Jewish people and the American people, and we've already seen that Americans are doing this anyways, if we migrate to universities and institutions and peoples and organizations that don't involve themselves with political indoctrination, that value and welcome and accept and want Jewish students, that care about Western civilization, that care about institutions of higher learning challenging individuals to go beyond their comfortable intellectual limits as opposed to just parroting this political propaganda, I think we as a country will be a lot better off, and we will diminish the power that that companies, that colleges like Columbia and Harvard have, and that organizations like Within Our Lifetime, like Students for Justice in Palestine, that if not now, currently have. So stop giving them the airtime. Stop sending your kids there. Certainly if you're an alum, stop giving your money there. They're just not worth it.
There appears to be double standards when campus administration enforce freedom of speech and hate speech codes on Ivy League campuses. Conservative speakers are often silenced by violent protesters, yet hateful, even terroristic language has been uncritically accepted on Ivy League campuses for months or on end. What are your thoughts of those double standards, and how do you think we should address them?
So again, I encourage all of you to read our lawsuit. Again, it's pinned on my social media. So most of what our lawsuit alleges is that actually the policies at Harvard are not necessarily inept. They're not. The policies are not bad, let's say. The problem is the enforcement. I mean, the enforcement is just simply non-existent when it comes to violations pertaining to anti-Semitism. So I spoke about they were ranked 248th, right? My first month of being a student at Harvard University, the Harvard Palestine Solidarity Committee, which is the largest compilation of idiots I've ever met in my life, they decide to invite, for the third time to campus, Muhammad al-Kurd. For those of you who don't know Muhammad al-Kurd, this is a dude who has professed, in total seriousness, that Jews eat the organs of Palestinians, that the Israeli occupying forces have internalized the ways of Nazi Germany. For those of you who have the misfortune of being on Twitter, number one, follow me, but number two, he has lamented how sad it is that Palestinians can no longer hijack planes anymore. And he actually just posted a video about a week or two ago saying, and I quote, "All Zionists must perish." So we went to the university and said, look, you have a track record. You have a track record of disciplining speech you don't like. I gave this example earlier. You rescind controversial speakers, you expel students. Why don't you simply apply that logic to someone who literally appears on the Anti-Defamation League's top 10 anti-Semites? And for the very first time, Harvard did something they'd never done before, which is shrug their shoulders and say, well, what do you want us to do about it? He has a First Amendment right. I mean, that is shockingly hypocritical. That's blatantly anti-Semitic, and as we will prove in court, it's discriminatory. So yeah, tonight I'm actually speaking very slowly, but oftentimes I'm told that I speak too fast, and in fact Ben Shapiro tells me to talk. It's a little weird, but Ben Shapiro is a great example of this. When Ben Shapiro speaks at a university, and just go on YouTube, and you can find this to be the case. When he speaks on a university, he requires private security. The mob will throw like Molotov, especially at Berkeley, they'll throw Molotov cocktails, they'll pull the fire alarm, they'll try to disrupt. There is, again, I'm not a conservative and I disagree with probably most of what Ben says. But there is something so fundamentally broken, not just on college campuses, but within our society, where young people cannot tolerate conservative voices, but not only can they tolerate, but they welcome anti-Semites and terrorist supporters. And again, don't just take my word for it. I just posted on Twitter, I'm very big into Twitter now. I just posted on Twitter like 2-3 hours ago. There were a couple of students today at Harvard. And by the way, just a preface to what I'm about to tell you, Harvard is relatively selective. Their acceptance rate is like 3%. It's not very high. Every student is chosen for a reason. Every student is chosen deliberately. These students were literally posting, "Rest in peace Nasrallah, rest in peace our hero." They were literally posting "Revenge is now" with videos of Iran, lobbying in the ballistic missiles. How in the world? I shouldn't say how in the world did they get accepted. Why? Why did Harvard accept them? Why did Harvard accept these people? Why is it that you have a young generation that is so unapologetic, so proud of their support for terrorism? Today's Tuesday, right? So today, this Tuesday, the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, in addition, the Center for Religion and Public Life, had an event today at Harvard University where they proudly and enthusiastically championed a memoir that one of the Harvard pressers smuggled out of an Israeli prison, written by a convicted Palestinian terrorist who killed a 25-year-old Israeli Jew in the 90s. And they glorified this guy. The book is called A Tale of Two Walls or something. They celebrated him. They said, come listen to his remarkable words of courage in the face of adversity. Why is it that universities will need private security to bring in Ben Shapiro, but when it comes to just celebrating terrorism, it's just normalized? And again, this is not just a Jewish problem. This is not just something that if you care about Israel and if you care about anti-Semitism, you should be concerned. Every American must be concerned about this. Young people are being fed a diet, and they're being fed this diet in the classroom. A diet of lies, a diet of propaganda, and a diet of indoctrination. So again, what can we do about it? Call them out and hold them accountable. Stop sending your kids to these universities. Stop donating millions of dollars to these universities. Sue these universities. I mean, they're just not worth the intelligence and the time of the Jewish people and of the American people. And I'll close by saying this. This is going to sound really anti-Semitic out of context. Jews do not need Harvard. Harvard needs Jews. Jews are resourceful. We are innovative. We are creative. I mean, if you look at half of Borough Park, I mean, half of them didn't go to high school. We will be titans of industry. We will be leaders in whatever we choose to do because that's who we are. We've been around for 3,000 years, and guess what? We're going to be around for another 3,000 years plus. Harvard needs us way more than we need them. If they want to continue to deliberately accept a significant proportion of a student body that burns American flags, that interrupts classrooms, that yells for an intifada, it's your funeral. I mean, go for it. But we should not play any role in propagating that institution or those systems.
I have a last question, and we can move to questioning from the audience. I'm sure there are many. The state of Florida has explicitly called on all state universities to flag anti-Semitism as per orders by the governor. Do you believe those policies can be effective curb of anti-Semitism?
So it's an interesting question. With Florida specifically, I haven't read the executive order closely. I have heard complaints that this might, by accident, not deliberately, this might actually curtail a lot of Jewish studies classes that talk about anti-Semitism. As someone who studies the Holocaust, I basically exclusively deal with anti-Semitism. So in that case, it's good to learn about anti-Semitism. I sort of need to read Mein Kampf. That's kind of what I do. So I've heard that there are problems, but as I said, I don't know the specifics. So I can't really comment on Florida. What I will say is Governor DeSantis, Chancellor Ben Sasse of the University of Florida school system, they just simply been remarkable. And they did what every university president should have done, which is you have a right to peacefully protest the moment you threaten a student, the moment you lay your hands on a student, the moment you block an entrance to a library or a class to another student. Your ass is getting thrown out of this university, and that's exactly what they did. They did that at the University of Florida. They did it at Georgia Tech. They did it at Texas A&M. Unfortunately, these are almost exclusively universities in the South, so I am trying not to wade into politics, but you get what you vote for. And Ron DeSantis, again, I disagree with most of his policies, but credit where credit is due. He's been a real fighter, and we appreciate his efforts. In terms of curriculum overviews, I think they're appropriate in the same way that you wouldn't want, I'm trying to frame and phrase this without sounding too controversial, so I'll be really vague on what I mean by this, but you'll probably infer what I mean by this. In the same way, you wouldn't want public school teachers teaching your second and third graders about sexually explicit material. So therefore you would want their curriculum plans or their lesson plans to be reviewed by a principal or a superintendent or whoever it may be, which is pretty standard, by the way. My mom works in the Jewish day school system. It's pretty standard that her material is reviewed, not because she did anything wrong. They just want to make sure that her values are in line with the school values, which is pretty normal. I think universities should do the exact same thing. So if there are teachers, which newsflash, there are, we've identified them, we filed complaints against them. If there are teachers who are saying, I'm going to cancel class so you can protest for the Intifada, but don't worry, I'll give you free credit, that's a problem. If there are teachers who are teaching us fact, which again, they've done this at Harvard, I was part of these classes, when they teach us fact that the Israeli occupying forces are analogous to Nazi Germany in how they treat the Palestinian people, when they treat the Holocaust as analogous to the plight of the Palestinians, that is forget about false, but that is inflammatory, and more importantly, that's a political bias. That is putting their political agenda in the classroom, and this is why I keep saying it's not just an anti-Semitism issue. We should not have professors or university instructors or anyone putting in their personal political preferences or their biases or their political agendas in a classroom. I was very clear in my speech at the RNC that all too many university professors are teaching their kids what to think and not how to think. It's fine for people to have opinions, and they should be able to express them freely. But as was just reported by Harvard University today, they had a university-wide study, and they surveyed their students, and the majority of students said that they feel uncomfortable expressing their own opinions in the class because they're scared, quite rightly, that their professor will penalize them. I mean, that was my experience. I changed what I wrote on my final paper on a class on Israel-Palestine, because I knew what the professors wanted to hear. Lo and behold, I got an A+. So that's a major, major problem. So I would look at this and I would frame this not as Big Brother cracking down, but simply making sure that your curriculum is in line with Harvard's value of veritas, of truth. And all too often we're seeing professors who don't particularly care about truth, they care about their agenda. So I applaud any efforts that take this issue seriously.
Let's move to the questions. Yes, please.
This may be outside your scope, but how do you think AI is going to affect anti-Semitism? Do you think that AI can be manipulated into an anti-Semitic stance?
Well, it already is. I mean, we've seen, October 7th is the best example of it. So again, I studied the Holocaust. That's definitely within my area. That's like my one area that I'm good at. The Holocaust denial took a couple of decades to manifest. There are a couple of reasons for it, but one of the reasons is people did not have the free flow of information as fast as they do today. And they certainly weren't able to manipulate information as fast as they are today. On the night of October 7th, there was already just fake videos and fake images being distributed mostly by troll farms in Russia, Iran, and Qatar, but really from individual lone wolves as well, that would show images of Israeli Apache helicopters shooting down Israeli civilians, that would deliberately create videos and images, again, that were all fake, showing Palestinians. I saw these images, Palestinians being decapitated in Gaza by the Israeli settler regime. This is before Israel even went into Gaza. So we've already seen that if you want to distort the reality, if you want to create Israel as a pariah state, yeah, just use AI. Why not? Why wouldn't you? So it's going to be a real problem. I mean, it already is a real problem that you have to be so careful, especially on social media, who you're looking for. The fact that I was able to see videos today on social media from the Iranian Islamic regime saying that we are merciful, but we will not be cowed into silence, that's really dangerous. So we're already seeing AI as a major, major problem in this space.
Because I feel like social media is probably worse than the educational system.
Yeah, just read the comments I get on social media. It's terrible. I couldn't agree with you more. How we deal with it, I don't know. I mean, I'm really not in that space. In terms of the solutions, I can certainly identify the problems, which is it's just so out of hand at this point. I mean, some of the biggest names on social media are just vehement anti-Semites, and they post things that are just so objectively false, either video that has been doctored or manipulated, and by the time there's a community note, or by the time they take it down, which they very seldom do, the damage has already been done.
Yeah.
Do we have more questions?
So, about enforcement. You talk a lot about enforcement of certain crimes and speech enforced one way and another way. So I'm a really big fan of commentary, John Horowitz, whatnot. And there was a lot of one of the articles that recently really talked a lot about if you go back 20 years ago, after 9/11 in New York City, would anyone allow the flags of terrorist organizations on the streets? No way. But now, what do we get? In U.S. and Canada, you see, okay, Hamas flags. People say, oh, it's free speech, right? And so there's a permissiveness of crime, shoplifting, $950 rules, the crime, carjacking, crime that's increased so much in the United States. I live in Massachusetts, we talked about, unfortunately it's not as bad in Massachusetts, but in California.
My bike was stolen in Massachusetts, it's
Okay,
bad.
okay. But in New York and California, it's permissiveness of crime, as well as anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Sure, you hit the nail on the head, and in fact, I always make this point. the fact, okay, I'm not trying to diss on the ADL. So if anyone works for the ADL, I like what they do. They're good. We like them. But the fact that the immediate reaction of so many Jewish donors and influential figures is to just donate to organizations like the ADL or a Holocaust museum. These are good things, and they do good things. But if you really want to solve anti-Semitism, it's not by bringing Kanye West to the Holocaust Museum. I mean, that gives them a lot of good ideas. What you should do is just enforce the law. Just stop incentivizing criminals to commit crime. But what we've done, whether, again, now I'm going to get a little political, whether it's the southern border, whether it's the subways of New York, whether it's the streets of LA, we have just allowed a culture of criminality to exist. And I said it earlier, but I'll say it again. We in this country have become allergic to accountability. No one takes responsibility for anything anymore. Even the NYPD. And now I can say this because he's in a lot of trouble. I do not like Eric Adams. I wouldn't have said that a week ago because, he's our mayor, but he won't be our mayor for much longer. Because yes, he talks the talk, but it took him like a week to do anything about Columbia University. And his excuse was just factually inaccurate. He said, we're not allowed to go to Columbia until they call us. That's just not true. You have authority over Columbia University. And he wouldn't do anything. And as I said, the 150, 180 were non-students. And the overwhelming majority who were arrested were released like a day later by the DA, Alvin Bragg, as we had a rally outside of his office. Just prosecute crimes. That more than anything else, more than any Holocaust museum, more than any ADL dinner, more than anything, that will decrease anti-Semitism. Is there racism in the United States? Of course. Will you ever get rid of racism? No, because it's an ideology. But what you can do is criminalize racism. So if some racist were to tell a black person, go to the back of the bus, his ass is going to be in jail that night. So while it's true you can't crack down on a mentality, you can crack down on the manifestation of that mentality. So I'm under no illusions that we will eradicate anti-Semitism, but I do believe, because it is possible, to make sure that anti-Semitism cannot manifest in the form of drawing swastikas on university property, in the forms of physical assault in New York, in the forms of blocking Jews from worshiping in their synagogue, like in LA. But the problem is we just don't have policymakers who are willing to do that. So yes, the key to battling anti-Semitism is the enforcement of law. And again, that's why I think our lawsuit is so important, because if they are not going to hold themselves accountable, then we will force them to be held accountable.
Yes, please.
Yes. So you mentioned this trade-off between agenda and truth. Can you tell us about a conversation you had that you were able to change in debate, truth or agenda, and how did you do it?
Unfortunately, in terms of changing people's mind, I've never been able to do that with Israel-Palestine, because the others, let's just call it like it is, the other side is just not willing to engage. They say it themselves. Okay, this is going to sound a little biased because I'm talking about myself, but I am willing. I love having conversations with people who disagree with me. And I would argue that's probably why I'm so sympathetic to the Palestinian cause. I really am. I believe in a two-state solution. That's why I believe that we should free Palestine from the dictatorial, tyrannical regime known as Hamas. I agree with the premise of the pro-Palestinian protesters. I agree with I just disagree wildly with their conclusion. Their conclusion is the eradication of the Jewish state from the river to the sea. My conclusion is the eradication of the terrorist organization. So we agree on the premise that there should be self-determination, that there should be self-expression, that they should be able to vote. Actually, many of them don't believe that they should be able to vote. But we agree on the premise, we disagree on the conclusion. What I have been able to sort of create more nuance and convince people is actually on Trump. I found a lot more success with that. Because when people say, how can you vote for Trump when he says X, Y, Z? Actually, I'll give you an example. When he said 2-3 weeks ago, I was there. He actually said it twice. I was there when he said it at a fundraiser, and I was there an hour later when he said it at the IAC conference. He said, if I don't win, Jews will be responsible for it. And if I don't win, you won't have an Israel. Like Israel will cease to exist. Something crazy. And even though I support Trump, and I think he's earned the right, he's earned the Jewish vote, the next morning I spoke in front of the Israel-American Council, in front of 5,000 people, including Miriam Adelson, and I said these suggestions, the comments, that Israel would cease to exist, that Israel would be to blame for an election loss are unproductive at best and morally reprehensible at worst, and I condemn them 100%. The problem is, especially in electoral politics, we are so caught up in our partisan or hyper-partisan agendas, we are unable to admit when our candidates do the wrong thing. And when people realize that, yeah, I disagree with Trump on a lot. I believe in reproductive rights for women. I believe in a $15 minimum wage. I believe in some variation of a Green New Deal. And I also admit that Trump agrees with none of that. And I really hate that Trump disagrees with none of that. And I'm still going to vote for him because I believe that when you have 7 American hostages, climate change is irrelevant if they're dead. When you have Israel experiencing 200 ballistic missiles and my whole family spending days on end in bomb shelters, they're not really going to care what the minimum wage is.
280.
Sorry?
280.
Right, 280. So when I'm able to express that with people who can't stand Trump, I'd like to think I've been able, not necessarily sway, but show people that we can disagree with each other, but we're not these fascist, tyrannical villains that you think we are. And I don't think they are these misguided, bleeding heart liberals that the other side portrays them to be. So when people realize that I'm just a normal dude and I have some policies that you might disagree with and some policies you do agree with, that I've been able to find a lot more acceptance and a lot more common ground.
Jim, I know you have a question.
No, I'm just enjoying listening.
Oh, thank you.
This was not a question I've thought of, but being put on the spot. So I think a separate issue than what you've been talking about tonight is the internal quandary that Jews recently and certainly for a long time have felt, particularly as American Jews or liberal Jews, regarding the use of force and other people's suffering. So I think that where you take the slice of context can often be where your moral filter comes into play. And I think that for Jews, there's the grand historical view where there can be a lot of consensus, and then for use of weaponry that maybe has unexpected amounts of civilian casualties in Gaza or whatever, can also evoke certain kind of responses as well in the same people and sometimes contradictory. So I'm wondering, as a person who said that you've been consistently anti-Bibi, as a character in modern Israeli history that often brings out some of these conflicts, the grand historical one and the current historical one. How do you navigate that as an individual intellectual?
Sure. Well, first of all, I would add, whether it was the Bibi government or a government led by Yoav Gallant, Yair Lapid, Benny Gantz, or even Ben Gvir, they would be doing almost nothing differently than what the current government is doing. And I think that there is this fallacy, certainly in the American media, that if we just got rid of Bibi, things would be different. I can promise you Benny Gantz is not interested in a ceasefire. Yair Lapid is not interested in a ceasefire. When I say ceasefire, so let's be clear. That's number one. In terms of this sort of universal, in biblical terms, we have this saying, Esav sones Yaakov. That Esav, which I think in English is translated as like Esau, the two sons of Jacob, Esau always hates Jacob because Jacob got the firstborn blessing, Esau didn't, and Esau's descendants are modern day Muslims. His son was Ishmael. Ishmael was sort of the father of what later began the Islamic movement. So in biblical terms, we'll say, yeah, this conflict has always existed. Well before the Palestinian state, well before the Israeli state. That's actually true. I mean, the conflict really has existed for thousands of years. You can go all the way back to the first massacres in Mecca and Medina, or you can go to as close to 1929, the Hebron massacres, when 29 Jewish civilians were killed by Arab rioters. So that I'm probably more sympathetic to. I do think that this conflict has very little to do with the modern state of Israel. I think it's used as a pretext in the same way that most anti-Semites use the state of Israel as a pretext for their anti-Semitism. It used to be you wouldn't call Jews Jews, you would call them the communists or the capitalists. Now you just call them the Zionists. So it's whatever the convenient historical context is, you would just go for it. In terms of how you deal with the particularities, I would agree, no one likes to see civilian suffering, no one likes to see civilian death, What I can say is thank God my generation was not alive during World War II, because we would have never been able to invade Normandy. We would have never been able to engage in the Battle of Berlin. We would never be able to defeat the Axis. Why? Because just every day on social media you would see an image of another beautiful blonde hair, blue-eyed German child with her arm cut off. And look, more Germans were killed in World War II than Americans. Does that mean the Germans were right? Germans suffered way more casualties. Their economy was destroyed. I mean, 1945 is literally called year zero in German history textbooks because it was so awful. The scale of destruction and devastation was unlike any country had ever experienced or has experienced in modern history. But does that make the Allied fight any more or less warranted? Not at all. So yeah, we don't like to see civilian suffering, and I wish Gaza, or Hamas specifically, would have taken the billions of dollars they received in annual aid, more per capita than any people have received since the Marshall Plan, and build one bomb shelter. Instead, they built tunnels. They built a more complex tunnel system than the London Underground. They don't care about their people, which is why you have so many deaths. So I agree that it's terrible, which is why I would wish that my classmates would call for the immediate eradication of Hamas, or at the very least for Hamas to surrender and return the hostages. But instead, they've allied themselves with the people who have brought in years of misery and death and destruction to their own people. That's Hamas. So there is no war in the 21st century more just and more justified than the war Israel is currently engaged with Hamas.
David always have a great questions. Yes.
Oh, and you were the piano player, right?
And not just this, also
Oh.
leading journalist for a Sunday,
Wow, okay. I used to play piano.
and many more.
So Audre Lorde said that one of her, she had 3 intellectual articles of faith, and the third one was, and it seemed to come out of left field, was absolute urgent solidarity with the Palestinian cause. And I guess at that time it would have been. So this goes back a long time, and we seem to have a problem that goes back to the 70s with, there's a sympathy with, I guess it started with Arafat, became very, very fashionable, but we have a very entrenched, tenured, old school, hard Marxist, and they're part of the establishment, right? You're talking about Harvard, I would say that, and they're everywhere. They're really, really. I mean, I'm saying this as an academic myself. Received my doctorate in philosophy, and that was the thing. Like, you basically have to sort of, my thesis supervisor would be 100% horrified by the conversation we're having, right? She's the person who gave me the Audre Lorde quote, but I worked with her, So, how do we begin to address this, right? Because you are suing Harvard, and you're suing one of the entrenched academic establishments that are indoctrinating students.
Yeah,
in
it's
this manner, right? And it seems to me very, very monolithic.
It's a tough question because there's no easy solution. In a weird way, it's actually easier to sue Harvard, for money or for implementation of policies, because those are very practical things that they could just do in a day. The tenured system and the indoctrination in the classrooms are so, as you said, entrenched and have been there for decades now. I mean, how do you even solve that problem? It's a really good question. Look, I'll say this. Number one, the idea that tenured professors are untouchable, that you cannot get rid of them, is simply not true. Harvard last year got rid of a tenured professor for committing sexual assault. Now, I agree sexual assault is a pretty bad thing to do, and that would certainly warrant cause. Is canceling class for an intifada, does that compare? Probably not. But consistent violations of school policy after you've been warned, I think that could reasonably be argued. If you don't share the mission or values of the university, you shouldn't be there. So there is a course, there is a path for Harvard to discipline tenured professors. There are not these demi-figures that we cannot get rid of. It's just not true. It is hard, but that would be a good first step. Again, it's such a tough question because I have a friend of mine, I won't say her name, but she's at Harvard, and she studies Yiddish literature, which is not a very popular field. And if any of you know anything about Yiddish literature, or you've heard Alan Dershowitz talk about Yiddish literature, it is almost exclusively filled with the most anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic people you've ever met in your lives. In fact, that's one of the reasons they go into Yiddish literature, because they will say, we can exist as Jews in the 21st century without living in Israel, without learning or speaking the Zionist language, because Yiddish, that's our real language. And where do they all vacation in the winter? They all go to Azerbaijan in the Soviet Union, or today, modern Russia. If you don't know what Azerbaijan is, you should Google it. Very fascinating point. It's funny, when I say Azerbaijan, most people don't know. Okay, so I always ask her, why are you in this field? Because she's a Zionist, she's very vocal about it, she has no friends in that field. And she says, because she has lots of friends, just not in that field. I'm her friend, okay? And I'm like, why do you do this? And she said, and to her credit, I mean, really to her credit, she said, because I know that this field is full of the anti-Semites and the anti-Zionists, and I want to be a lone voice of reason and clarity and morality. And credit to her, because she's going against a uphill battle. So maybe I would say we need more like-minded academics. That's maybe an easy answer, but honestly, I've been so disillusioned with academia, certainly at the ivory towers, that I don't even know if I would encourage it. I was considering doing a PhD program as well at Harvard, and then of course October 7th hits, and I just want no more part in it. So I don't know, it's a very tough question. It's something I've been asked before, and usually I'm asked the same questions and I can give relatively polished answers, but that's one of the few that I don't know. The tenured system and the curriculum, it's just so hard. I don't know. It's a good point.
Let's take one last question.
Yeah.
I know you need to go.
I have to be, so I'm a surrogate for the Trump campaign, hold your booze, and they really want me to be in the spin room for the debate, so I do have to leave early. But before I get, after I answer the last question, I do have to run out. You can get my email is my name, Shabbos Kestenbaum at Gmail, but Anna has all my contact info, so feel free to give it out.
Thank
I'm
you.
more than happy to be in touch with all of you.
So I'm 24. I've been out of college for 2 years, and like you, I opened my phone the days after October 7th and was just so horrified to see some of the egregious things my peers were posting, and it's so clear to me that a lot of people my age have been indoctrinated with anti-Semitic hate. So the first part of my question is, what bills in Congress can we support to stop anti-Israel and anti-Semitic indoctrination on the college campus? I know there's an investigation into the Qatari money that was donated to schools and Ivy Leagues. And then the second part is, what besides universities, what else is a cause of anti-Semitic indoctrination, and how can we stop that?
Sure, great question. I'm glad to hear you're not in college anymore. Again, this is a plug for you following me on social media, because I do talk about these bills, these pieces of legislation. The most recent one, literally filed a week ago by Richie Torres, is literally called the No Foreign Gifts Act, which is relatively self-explanatory. It would forbid a country like China, like Qatar, like Iran, like Russia, that funds terrorism to donate to any American institution of higher learning. I mean, that's just like an obvious no-brainer, and as I wrote in my post, it's a damn shame it took this long. Another is the Deterrent Act. The Deterrent Act was passed in the House. It's being held up in the Senate by Chuck Schumer. That would really strengthen the rules and regulations surrounding foreign money in universities. A third, which is also being held up in the Senate by Chuck Schumer, is called the Antisemitism Awareness Act. Again, passed in the House, bipartisan. It would do a lot of good things, including incorporating the International Holocaust Remembrance Line's definition to all federal agencies when looking at anti-Semitic crimes or allegations of crimes. And then there are a couple of others that would just be good. The Countering Anti-Semitism Act. There's it's less of a bill because it's actually already law. And the law is, if you're a student on a foreign visa and you violate American law, you're deported. That's been law for 50 years. I was on a student visa in Israel for 3 years. If I violated Israeli law, my ass would be sent to New York on the first flight. So when I said that during the RNC, I support Trump's policies of deporting students who violate law, I was labeled by Jews as a racist, as a xenophobe, and I don't understand why that suddenly became controversial and partisan, because it's literally been law for 50 years. The problem is it's never enforced. So Sally Kornblue, who's the moron who runs MIT, she was straight up asked. She said, look, you have students on a foreign visa system who physically assaulted Jews on your campus, who forbade students from entering libraries. Why haven't you expelled them? And it's remarkable, not that she thought this, but she said this out loud. She said, well, we can't expel them because if we expel them, they'll be deported, so we have to keep them. What? So, that's another piece. Again, it's less of a law because it's less of a bill because it's already law, but that's something that we should push our government to enforce. So lots of things like that. There's a plethora of issues. And then also, broadly speaking, this should not be a partisan thing, but it is. The Republicans have had 12 hearings on anti-Semitism. The Senate Democrats have had 0. We should push the Senate Democrats to have hearings on anti-Semitism. Not all forms of hatred, not all lives matter, but on anti-Semitism, so we should push them to do that. And then in terms of the indoctrination, you're right, it's not just from the universities, it's our society. Look, Richie Torres actually has another bill that would ban, or excuse me, not ban, but would force the sale of TikTok from ByteDance. ByteDance is a company controlled by the Chinese Communist Party, and in fact, TikTok, which is where most of your kids get their information from, is regulated in China so that most of the videos Chinese kids see are all educational videos, or videos that encourage physical activities or intellectually stimulating curriculum. Of course, in the United States, the videos your kids are watching, and I'm not making this up, are AI-generated translations of Adolf Hitler's speeches, of Osama bin Laden's letter to America, our Al Jazeera networks. So making sure the Chinese Communist Party cannot infect the minds of young people, there are lots of pieces like that. So I'll close by saying this. Number one, please stay in touch. But number two, just by having me, Anna, and by inviting me to this really beautiful space. As I said, I've never been on such a comfy couch.
Please come back.
Yeah, I'm going to come back for the couch. You've done far more than Harvard and Columbia and MIT have ever done, and not just listen to Jewish students. You've amplified our voices, you've heard our message, and now you can go back to your communities and say, it's not an exaggeration, this is not simply acts of anti-Zionism, but this is like unvarnished anti-Semitism. And my great aunt is a survivor of Kristallnacht. She's still alive in her 90s. And Kristallnacht did not begin with the burning of books. It did not begin with mass deportations. The Holocaust did not begin with Auschwitz. It did not begin with gas chambers. It began with the acceptance, the normalization, and the celebration of anti-Semitism. And while there are, of course, differences between the experiences of German Jewry and American Jewry, one thing that is eerily similar is that celebration of anti-Semitism. And again, take it from the pseudo-intellectual who studies the Holocaust at Harvard. Who are the ones who were leading Kristallnacht? Who are the ones throwing the books in the fire? It was the university students. It was the young, most intelligent, most morally sensitive. They were the first ones to say, kites off the streets, or back, ironically, they would say back to Palestine. So we cannot allow these relatively small, I'm putting that in quotes, small acts of anti-Semitism to go unchallenged, because we know where they can lead to. So really, I do have to run, but thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for coming.
Yes, of course, really, thank you for amplifying our voices, and we're in this together. Thank you.